Hi, I'm Josh Carter, and this is Flying for Life. 40 years ago, musician and activist Sir Bob Geldof saw the BBC's shocking biblical famine report from Ethiopia, which sparked the 1984 record-breaking #1 hit, Do They Know It's Christmas, and the charity concert Live Aid. I speak to MAF's Keith Ketchum, one of the flight crew at the time, who delivered hundreds of tons of food aid and enabled the BBC to capture that famous footage, which changed the face of fundraising forever. I'm also joined by Sam Baguma from MAF's disaster response team, who shares how MAF tackled disasters today. Now, Keith, let's jump straight in to this amazing story. I mean, when was it that you first heard about the famine crisis in Ethiopia, and what information was coming out of the country at that time?
Yeah, so World Vision International had established a presence there, and they were sensing that famine was getting worse. There were pockets of food shortage. The rains had failed for 3 or 4 years in a row, and they had gone ahead and bought an airplane, but they didn't have any flight crew. So they asked Mission Aviation Fellowship to provide the flight crew, and that's when I got the call.
Now, I'm right in thinking that wasn't exactly what you were intending to do, because actually you were an MAF engineer. Is that right?
I had been an aircraft engineer in the airlines, and I had left the airlines and started on my flight training at a Christian university in Canada. And I was about 3 months into that when the call came. And it was a guy who had been in Ethiopia for many years. And then he started working for MAF. And then he said, we need you to go to Ethiopia or 87,000 people are going to die. And I thought that was quite compelling. And to make a long story short, I packed my bags. I went out with a job profile of being the director of maintenance to keep the airplane going. And on the first morning, we sat down at breakfast with the other 3 crew members, and they said, now, you are going to help us fly, aren't you? And because I had 100 hours and a private pilot's license, that's all they needed. So I said, oh, twist my arm, sure. So for 3 weeks of the month, we would be out in a remote location, just flying every day. And then on the 4th week of the month, we would come back to the capital, Addis Ababa. And that's when I really had to get working because I was the engineer.
It's a good job you did, because then an amazing story unfolds. Was that Twin Otter plane similar to what MAF had, what you were used to, or not?
The Twin Otter is a twin turboprop plane which can seat 19 passengers. Of course, we ripped the seats out and put 2 tons of grain in instead. Our typical aircraft we were using at the time was a Cessna 206, which could seat 5 passengers. Quite a lot of difference. The other advantage of the Twin Otter is differential reverse thrust. So landing on a muddy runway, we can select one engine or the other to put more or less thrust to stop very quickly.
It sounds like the equivalent of the handbrake turn in a car. Maybe not. I'm assuming the Twin Otter is better in wetter conditions then, yeah?
That's right. We were going into certain airstrips which had never been accessed in the rainy season in Ethiopia. And they sent me to a couple of courses. And by February 1984, I was in country, maintaining the aircraft to the best of my ability.
Wow. Tell us about the first thing you saw when you flew in. I mean, what was the pictures like?
So I got to drive the length of Ethiopia to a place way up in the mountains where we established an operation. And all the way along, I could see the effects of famine. Later on, when we were driving up into the north, I saw so many just dead cattle lying all around. So the cattle, even the cactus fences around people's farms were dead. After 4 years of having no rain, everything was just a dust bowl.
And how quickly did you realize that actually this was a bigger problem than even, tragically 87,000 people dying, as had been said to you? How quickly did you realize, well, actually, this is bigger?
World Vision would have a warehouse with the grain bags, and we would just shuttle. We would just go from one airstrip to another, drop off the grain bags, come back for another load. We would do that 10 or 12 times a day normally. We were then called into the office in around June or July 1984, and our World Vision country director told us, guys, we're using a teaspoon and we need a wheelbarrow. And that's when we realized that the situation was very dire.
So what did a typical day look like, if indeed there was a typical day?
Basically, we would try to get up and be airborne just as the sun was coming up. So we had about 12 hours of daylight, and we had 2 crews, captain and co-pilot. And so we would fly from sunup to sundown. We had fuel and the grain positioned at the bases we were flying from, which was at the end of a road. And we would fly them over to a place which was beyond roads. So we were all over the place. We were in the south in Arba Minch, in the west in Gambela, Mizan Teferi, in the mountains of Baligoba. Basically, when we got into the middle of the country later on in the year of 1984, that's when it started to really hit. And we were based in a military airstrip called Kombolcha. The government was intent on a resettlement program, so they were moving people around the country to places where they didn't know the farming methods or the timing of planting or harvesting. So there was a lot of internal displacement going on, and that just exacerbated the problem.
Keith, tell us about some of the things that you were flying around during those trips.
Well, mainly it was bags of grain, which are very good passengers because they don't complain about your landings. But we would throw 20 bags in, and they were heavy. They were 100 kilos, and they would be brought to the airplane cargo door and put into the cabin of the plane. But often we would be carrying milk powder or cooking oil, because not a lot you can do with just kernels of grain.
So was it round about now that they said to you, okay, you're going to fly this guy around called Michael Burke from the BBC? Now, of course, we know with retrospect what this was all about, but did you have any idea who Michael Burke even was?
No, I actually had a very dim view of journalists because they had been trickling in. When we carried journalists, we had to take a grain bag off because of the weight. And so every time a journalist traveled with us, I was a bit miffed.
Yeah, I can see why. But then, of course, Michael Burke comes along. And then during that biblical famine report, when you were flying the journalists around, what was actually happening during that time?
We found out about 2 days before we actually flew him and Mike Wooldridge and Mohammed Amin, the cameraman, that we were going to do this. And it was up to World Vision to get the permissions for us to fly them, because this was not something we would typically do. And we took them up to Mekelle, which is a northern capital, you might say. And it was very bad up there. And I walked around the feeding camp with Mike Wooldridge, carrying his tape recorder. We then took the airplane up to Asmara, which is in Eritrea, and came back. We were going to fly them to a predetermined place where they could do their filming. Unfortunately, we got word that place, called Lalibela, had been overrun by the rebels. So we had to change our plans and fly them to a place called Alamata. We took time to circle around some of the feeding camps in Alamata, and I let Mohammed Amin, the videographer, get into my co-pilot seat. And in the Twin Otter, you can just lower the window and put the lens out the window. So he got some excellent aerial footage of the feeding camps. From there, they drove up the hill to a place called Coram. And that is why that landmark film footage was filmed in Coram. When the film crew got back from their time in Coram, we got them into the airplane and flew from Alamata back to Addis Ababa. And then they caught their flight back to London. And the video was then edited and aired on the 23rd of October.
I mean, it is probably, I would argue, the most famous news report of all time. Really. I think everyone can remember seeing it and him talking about that kind of biblical famine and the way he worded it. But then, of course, you were the one who enabled that to happen, which is really quite something, particularly when you didn't really even realize what was going on at the time.
True. The fact that they were the BBC, of course, that was very impressive. We had no idea what the result of this would be. I had other things on my mind. On October 24th, I proposed to my girlfriend at her mission school, and she laughed because I was interrupting her math class.
Did she say yes, though?
She did say yes eventually.
Oh, well, thank goodness for that. That's all right then. So, as you said, that report landed on BBC on the 23rd of October, 1984. Everyone saw it, including a certain Bob Geldof, of course, of the band the Boomtown Rats, saw the report. And then it's just amazing what happens. He then teams up with fellow musicians. And, of course, they create Band-Aid, which again is just absolutely legendary now. And all those 80s musicians with the massive hair and the mullets. I mean, we're talking about people like George Michael, it was Culture Club as well, of course, Sting, Paul McCartney, U2, Duran Duran, Bananarama, Spandau Ballet, Status Quo, Call 'em a Gang. They get together, don't they? And they create Do They Know It's Christmas? Shot to number one in December 1984, and at that point was in fact the UK's fastest selling single, over 3.8 million copies. And of course it still raises money, doesn't it, today, Keith, that song? Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? I think it's something like 200 million now for famines right across Africa. How does it feel when you think, well, do you know what, maybe you could have had the hump and you said, oh, you don't like journalists coming into play and you'd rather take a grain bag? I mean, imagine if you'd done that. Things could have turned out rather differently, couldn't they?
Yeah, we always have things to learn. And that's one thing I learned. I have a very high estimation of journalists, for any of them listening out there. We couldn't have done this without that partnership, without that collaboration. And it just shows all of us are needed. The pilots, the engineers, the people on the ground, the feeding staff, the journalists, and of course, those who are sending in money. The sky became black with Hercules transport aircraft, and a nation was saved. I think Bob Geldof and his buddies taught a generation that it was cool to be compassionate.
Yeah, which is definitely amazing, isn't it? One more question I want to ask you. You make quite an amazing claim, Keith, that your plane set a world record in terms of the amount of food carried during those months. So tell me about that.
Later on, when we were operating in the north of the country, we happened to be flying a 6-minute trip from one airstrip to another, which by road would take 10 or 11 hours by truck. So they knew that the airplane would be more effective. And so being a 6-minute flight, we could do several trips in a day. I don't think that the operation would hold up to our current standards of safety, but we would do 30 trips in a day, carrying 2 tons each time. So that's 60 tons in one day. We did that 3 days in a row. God. No one has disputed that record so far.
Wow. I mean, that is quite something. Sam, let's bring you in now. I mean, what's your reaction to this story? Because it is incredible, really, isn't it?
This is just an incredible story, because just listening to Keith talk about this, to me, it just brings in the fascinating picture of who MAF is. I can tell you that there is no other operator that has mastered the art of remote flight operations like MAF does. And that is why when disasters strike like this, it's almost like MAF was built up for this particular purpose, to be able to provide that access to people who are in isolated communities. Because when disasters strike, that is when the people are the most vulnerable and actually isolated from nearly everything.
So tell us a little bit about the Disaster Response Unit. When was it set up and what exactly does it do?
Back in 1976, that was the very first response that we did in Indonesia. There was the earthquake. Things developed really, really rapidly. And so for us to provide a rapid and most efficient response, we need to have been prepared to operate with very limited information, sometimes with very little equipment, but still be able to provide a safe operation. One of the first things that really goes is communications. And one of the things that MAF has now really mastered is setting up remote communication stations so that when we go into a disaster, the first thing we are able to do is to set up communication so that all the responders are able to share information. So we are able to go in a place and set up VSAT or Starlink connections. We employ what we call the mid-level approach to disaster response, where we say that during the time of peace, where there is no disaster, let us prepare ourselves for when something happens. And so then we carry on with our normal flight operations in remote locations. So during peacetime, we try to establish these very crucial partnerships so that when the disaster strikes, you know who to contact and they all know about you. And then you are able to move very, very rapidly. And then we have what we call the core team that manages MAF's Global Disaster Response Program. So we have 12 people. Some are in the US. I am in Africa. There's some in the UK. There's some in Australia. And so at any one given time, 3 or 4 of these 12 people have to be ready to deploy within 48 hours of a disaster happening. So in terms of the training that we have to receive, the equipment that we have to have, the understanding of disasters and how to respond, and getting permissions into very difficult countries, sometimes that are not easy to get into. So we do a lot of work ahead of time so that when something strikes, that's how we are able to deploy very rapidly.
As the Boy Scouts say, be prepared. Sounds like you definitely are. What about your role within that team, Sam? What do you particularly do?
My particular role is I'm an admin and operations specialist, and also I'm one of the managers that can actually take charge of a particular response. So as a manager who is in charge of all the logistics and the finances and putting the team together, once we hear of a disaster, within the first 12 hours, you are actually trying to put together a concept of operation where you are looking at what's the nature of disaster, what could actually be needed, who are we going to deploy, what assets do we have that can actually be able to deploy, who is actually going to respond with us, because we ourselves as MAF, we don't provide the blankets or the shelter equipment or the medicines or water purification stuff. So what we are trying to do there is to look at so many other organizations and then we facilitate them. We do the initial area surveys that then we are able to collect all the necessary information and pass it on to all other international responders within the first few hours of a disaster. And it is out of that other people then pick up the information and they are able to then say, okay, we will deploy and are able to respond to this disaster.
Is some of it raising money? I mean, do you do that first or after, or how does that work?
There are quite a number of international funding agencies that we run to in times of disaster, but also we keep a surge fund that can help us to mobilize very quickly. But then what we then do is that as we respond, we are busy fundraising and sending out messages to all our supporters to help fund the operations.
Sam, tell us about recent events in Kenya, because I know that you've led there in the disaster. I mean, this is very strange, isn't it? Because in Kenya, what happened was the worst drought for 40 years in May 2023. But then the very opposite disaster in many ways in March, less than a year, with devastating floods. What did you do in those situations?
We get fed with information from our partners of what is happening on the ground. So many farm animals actually were dying, and so many people in hunger, and we were being asked to take relief supplies to people who had lost all their livestock. You're actually taking dry food stuffs. So like we were working with people like the World Food Program. So we would be taking grain to these locations, particularly up in the north in Marsabit. That was actually one of the areas that was greatly affected. So then we are also taking water, because all their water points were completely dried out, and that's why their livestock were dying out. They had absolutely nothing. So we would work with people like World Relief, and they would be the ones collecting all the relief food supplies that people were needing. And then we would load them up on our planes and take them to the rural communities.
And was it the similar supplies for the floods as well?
Exactly the same, because the roads that lead up to the highlands in northern Kenya always go through Taribi Desert. The desert is always well known for its nice, beautiful sand dunes, but the entire desert had turned into one big mud slough, and it was a lake in some areas. So all the roads leading up to the highlands in northern Kenya were actually completely submerged. So the people up north were completely cut off.
Wow. So the MAF plane's more important than ever, really, because you can't drive up there.
At that point, that was exactly what was needed, because some of the areas that had been affected in the south, those were easy to reach and the government had already reached them. But the farthest places up north, what we were finding is that they had received absolutely no help whatsoever. So, but the reason was all the roads leading up there were completely saturated because of the rains.
It's incredible to think of a desert turning into mud. I mean, I believe that's the first time that's ever happened.
In this particular part, they'd never seen it, the whole desert turn into mud. And journeys that would normally take maybe 5 hours, we're taking them 6 to 7 days to be able to go through. And in some cases, it was completely impossible.
Wow, amazing. How many lives do you think MAF has saved or transformed during that time?
We went to one particular village in Kajiado where over 350 homes were all swept away in one night. So for us to be able to go into a village of 350 homes that have been completely swept away and then provide those homes with shelter, with food, with water purification tablets, and provide them with emergency food. You're talking of each homestead will probably have about 5 to 8 people. So that's a lot of people that all their livelihood had completely changed. And that's just one small little village. We were transporting a lot of building materials and relief supplies that would help rebuild the lives of the people that had been affected.
Now, Sam, we've heard from Keith about his amazing response, which, of course, was 40 years ago, not to make you feel old, Keith, there. When you were 25, I think, Keith, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, Sam, how different would things be now if the exact same thing was to happen in Ethiopia? Would it be the same response?
In many ways, it would be the same, because you're trying to deploy very, very rapidly in a situation that is changing. You only have about 20 to 30% of the information that you're trying to make a decision on. The one thing that would be very, very different is that aviation is actually highly regulated. Sometimes when I wish we would just go out and fly and be able to assist people like Keith used to do in those olden days. But at the moment, the regulations even of where you can fly, where you can take our aircraft sometimes is restrictive. But what is happening today is that just by one simple WhatsApp message, that message is going out to so many people. It goes so fast and is able to reach so many international responders in a very short period of time. The speed at which information is currently passing through and getting to as many people is just amazing. But also the other thing that has changed is that there seems to be more disasters at the moment, because at that very time that we were responding to the floods in Kenya, another of our team was responding in Brazil, and another team was actually up in Mozambique. So it's almost like there's so many things that are happening at the same time. And that is, to some extent, it is the effects of global climate change.
And of course, if you want to listen to our previous podcast, it's all about climate change and the effects of that. So do go and check that out. As you mentioned there, in the olden days, I like the way you said that, Sam, by the way. In the olden days, those sums of money that were raised and the level of awareness of that famine, I mean, it was astronomical, really. Little did you know, Keith, that when you flew the BBC in, it ended up raising, as we said, £200 million. That Live Aid concert, a global audience of 1.9 billion people. I mean, that's about 40% of the world at that time. So, Sam, do you think that kind of compares to now? What would happen today? Do you think these days, I mean, people seem to be asked for money all the time. Is that kind of an element, do you think, to that? A bit of compassion fatigue, perhaps?
I would say that it's not compassion fatigue, but rather that there seems to be more disasters happening almost at the same time. I just give an example. During the response we had for the outbreak of war in Sudan, and just as we were beginning to respond, the war in Ukraine kicked off, and then in Gaza. So before long, the media coverage actually shifts to another disaster. And before you know it, what you are actually seeing before you is completely forgotten, because everybody is looking at what is the next thing that is happening. The war in Sudan that has actually been raging since early last year is now estimated to be causing the worst humanitarian disaster in the world today. But you hardly ever hear what is really going on in Sudan, because there are so many other things that are happening around the world.
Yeah. So, Sam, how do your team decide how to respond and who to respond to then? Because you're saying all these things happening at once, which they obviously are. You don't have the resources to go everywhere. So how do you make that call?
So one of the key criteria is that, do we have partners in that particular area that are actually calling us to join them in the response? And then the other key component is that, how easy is it for us to be able to go into these countries? Because there are some countries that are actually completely closed off.
So, Sam, can you just explain to us about not being able to fly into Sudan and how that's affecting what MAF can do?
Yes, because this is a war situation, the airspace in Sudan has actually been closed off to all other operators. So we can't actually fly within Sudan. So we can only be able to support those who have come out of Sudan and are on the border with the neighboring countries. So Renk is at the border with Sudan. It is in the northernmost part of South Sudan. So we are able to fly in there. That's the farthest we can go up north.
Thanks, Sam. What is MAF doing in South Sudan at the moment, supporting the refugees there? What's actually happening?
So a lot of the refugees have left Sudan and are down in South Sudan. Some of them are in Chad, and we have a program in Chad where we're actually responding to the refugees that are in the western part of Sudan that have come out of, say, a place like Darfur. And then in South Sudan, we were taking a lot of relief supplies to the refugees that had left Sudan and were in South Sudan. And then with those similar flights, we would take the people who were injured or needing medical assistance, we would bring them all the way down to Juba.
And Sam, how badly injured are people there? You know, you mentioned they're taking people away, and what sort of things have you seen?
There you are actually seeing people who have shrapnel wounds, who have been in war zone. People have very bad gunshot wounds, or pregnant women who have come out of the area and they are so desperate to find medical facilities. We also see people with chronic conditions that can't be treated anymore because all the hospital and the medical facilities have been affected. So now they are trying to find somewhere else to continue with their ongoing care, and that is it's very difficult to find. So those are the people that we would then transport to get them the medical attention in the south.
How many people are anticipated to have died in that conflict so far?
At the moment, the estimates are around 150,000, but it is really difficult to know precisely the numbers. In reality, there are a lot more people suffering in these refugee camps than is being published.
And when you arrive at the refugee camp, what is it that you actually do to help?
We're actually taking in the relief workers who are taking in medical supplies. We transport a lot of the organizations that are providing them with food supplies, with clothes, with financing. Sometimes they're actually giving them money to be able to go and buy food in the local markets. So to us as MAF, we are privileged to be the facilitators of the organizations that are there to serve these refugees.
Yeah, Keith, let's bring you back in now. The actual impact of the famine was also very great, wasn't it? And according to the UN, around 1 million people actually reported to have died in that Ethiopian famine 40 years ago. So when you look back, what kind of difference did your flights make in that situation?
Yeah, I think the estimates I heard were that 7 million were in danger of starvation. So to say that only 1 million, and I've heard figures as low as 250,000, but it gives me great joy to know that 6 million people were saved.
So Keith, you obviously had a couple of caps on, shall we say? Most of the time you are now co-pilot, but also, of course, you've got this big background of engineering. So did that start playing a part in what you were doing as well?
I had one other crew member who was an engineer as well. And together we would do a 100-hour inspection to make sure the airplane was ready for the next month. In my 5-year career in the airlines, I rose to the position of certifying engineer. I was signing out 747s, DC-10s, even British Airlines 747s, 737s, and not really thinking much about it. When I got to Ethiopia and I was faced with one 20-place Twin Otter, it really began to affect me because I realized if I did not get this airplane airworthy, people were going to die. So I lost sleep over, that starter didn't sound so good this last time they started the engine. So the weight of responsibility was much greater than working for the airline.
Mm. And what do you remember most about those dark times? I mean, what are the things that, just never leave you?
Sam has been talking much about partnership and collaboration. And I just want to share a little story of when I went into that feeding camp in Alamata, which was sort of the center of our operation during that time. I realized that World Vision, who was running the feeding camp, was sharing it with the Missionaries of Charity, which are Mother Teresa's bunch. And I was able to spend some time in the camp one day because they needed a new radio antenna set up. And while I was there, I noticed that the World Vision staff would go down the line of people waiting for rations and pick out those who were likely to survive and take them to a shelter to be fed and to recover. But those dear, humble, compassionate missionaries of charity would go down that same line of people and take those who were unlikely to survive. They would be taken to a different shelter to die with as much dignity as the sisters could give them. And this made me furious. My young idealistic mind was thinking, why aren't the World Vision staff doing more? They should be showing more compassion. They should be at least trying to save their lives. Years later, I look back on this arrangement as possibly the most beautiful demonstration of the body of Christ working together.
Mm. Yeah, that really is a beautiful picture there.
Each group was doing their best
Yeah.
according to the gifting they had received, and each one knowing their physical limitations and the constraints of insufficient resources and the impact of what had already taken place due to apathy and injustice. But there they were, working side by side.
Mm. Yeah, it's an amazing picture you just painted for us there, Keith. And I can hear in your voice, even all these years later, that's really impactful, isn't it, on you? So, Keith, obviously you were flying into some pretty dangerous, scary situations. I mean, did you have to kind of look after yourself in some way or another?
Well, I guess we never let on to each other, young and foolish, that we were scared. But we did have the support of a security agent who had been ex-military. His name was McConan. He became like a father to us. He carried a 38 special pistol in a six-sack, and he called it his lunch. So whenever we'd get on board, he would generally fly the first flight of the day just to check things out, ear to the ground, make sure security was still good. And we'd say, "Hey, Mac, you got your lunch?" And he would grin broadly. "Yeah, I got my lunch." There was a case, I wasn't on that flight, but Mac said, "We need to go." And the guys flew the aircraft out whilst rebels were approaching the other end of the airstrip. So there were some tense times, but yeah, we never got shot.
Because you always had your lunch.
We had our lunch.
Brilliant. I love that. That's brilliant. And then if we fast forward 10 years after that, another incredible thing happened, because in 1995, you were actually able to fly Bob Geldof around to mark the 10th anniversary of the famine. So what was that experience like?
That was really great. By that time, I was the program manager. We had gone back to Ethiopia. And Bob was actually a very funny guy. And I had so much admiration for him and what he had accomplished. He was going through his breakup with Paula Yates at the time, and as well as being back in Ethiopia, it was quite an emotional time. Like I say, Bob has a wicked sense of humor. I remember doing the pre-flight prayer, as MAF pilots always do, and Bob had found his favorite place back by the cargo door. But I finished my pre-flight prayer for wisdom and safety, and then Bob raised his eyes heavenward and said, "Are you listening?"
That is great.
Yeah. We had 19 flights with Bob, and I think he left in no uncertain terms about what we were all about.
And Keith, how did the country compare 10 years later to what you'd seen a decade before?
Yeah, it was so encouraging. World Vision had various different sites that they had been working at, and if you don't bump your head on the mangoes hanging from the trees, it was absolutely changed. We had a flight program. It was not famine relief anymore. It was kind of back to the 1960s and 70s, just serving missions. We did have a contract with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We were very, very busy. The country had developed, and communications had developed, transport had developed. So that same kind of famine relief effort was not needed. At the end of 1998, we were asked to leave Ethiopia as MAF because the Investment Authority wanted national ownership. So I remember standing under the tail surface of one of our Cessna caravans and asking one of our Ethiopian staff members, Solomon Gazal, if he wanted to take this forward. And I remember him thinking for about 3/4 of a second and saying yes. Today, he operates 16 aircraft, a flying school. He can fly for famine relief. He can fly for development projects like mining, hydroelectric. MAF couldn't do that because we were restricted to relief only. So what is happening there now is more than MAF could have done. So taking a situation where we thought this is just terrible, us getting kicked out of the country, ended up being wonderful for the country. Solomon Gazal, who now runs Abyssinian Flight Services, is one of my best friends.
So, Sam, how do you then also decide when to stop? I mean, when do you pull out and say, okay, well, MAF's done its thing here, we're moving on?
In most cases, we are in a disaster situation for not more than 5 weeks. Typically, once the relief efforts turn into development and reconstruction, that stops being disaster response, and we pull back and then let other development agencies carry on with that kind of work.
And now 40 years later, Keith, you got all this experience. You're now 65 and you're still working for MAF today. You haven't retired. Well, you might have hung up your goggles. You're doing other things now, of course. But have you got any advice to Sam and MAF Disasters Response Team?
Yeah, I did hang up my goggles and silk scarf at the turn of the century. My name is still on the list of available engineers for disaster response. So that's something that Sam can count on. I'm ready to go. If I'm needed, I keep my licenses current. And what I do now is I sit in my basement in Vancouver creating engineer training materials, which could easily be used for someone who maybe isn't familiar with that type of aircraft. They can go through my course and learn more about it. Partnership is the key. And we can't do this by ourselves. We need partners. We need those who are experienced in shelter, in medicine, in disaster on the ground. We provide the transport and we provide logistics, but our partners are our most valuable asset.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. My big thanks to MAF's Keith Ketchum, one of the pilots who flew hundreds of tons of food aid in Ethiopia, which saved millions of lives, and Sam Baguma from MAF's Disaster Response Team. You've been listening to me, Josh Carter, and Flying for Life, MAF UK's podcast. Until next time, bye for now.